The heat of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in the summer of 1943 was unbearable. Sparks cascaded like molten rain, falling onto steel floors that vibrated with the pounding rhythm of machines. The war had transformed this place into an industrial symphony of fire and iron, where thousands of workers labored in shifts that blurred day and night. Among them was Hal Jensen, a welder whose hands were steady but whose work was not considered beautiful. His weld lines, the supervisors said, were ugly, uneven, bulky, and far from the smooth seams demanded by the manuals pinned to the workshop walls. Hal didn't argue. He wasn't a man of many words. He simply adjusted his visor, gripped his torch, and continued. Each day he would arrive before dawn, eat his breakfast of coffee and stale bread in silence, and take his place at the assembly line. His job was to weld the seams of Sherman tank hulls, massive slabs of armor that would one day roll across Europe. While others focused on precision, Hal focused on strength. He believed the steel spoke a language only experience could understand, and no rulebook could teach the right way to listen. He'd been a welder long before the war, patching up farm equipment in the small Iowa town he'd grown up in. Back then, his father told him, a clean weld don't always mean a strong one. The metal has its moods. Sometimes it needs to be ugly to hold. Those words stuck with him. When the Depression hit and his family lost their land, Hal took his skills to Detroit, where the government was desperate for welders to build tanks, planes, and ships. The plant supervisors were men in crisp uniforms who measured everything by sight and numbers. One of them, Mr. Donnelly, was a tall, thin man with a polished clipboard and an obsession with perfection. Jensen, he would bark, tapping the side of a freshly welded Sherman, your line looks like it's been chewed by a dog. Hal would glance at it, nod slightly, and say, maybe so. But it'll hold. Donnelly never believed him. He wrote notes, threatened warnings, and often said Hal's work would cost the plant its reputation for precision. Hal didn't care about reputation. He cared about the boys riding those tanks. His younger brother, Tommy, was one of them, stationed in North Africa with the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Division. Every time Hal picked up the torch, he imagined Tommy inside one of those steel beasts, counting on welds like his to keep the enemy's shells from tearing through. It wasn't beauty he was after, it was survival. The other welders often joked about Hal's work. Ugly Weld Jensen, they called him. One of them, a fast-talking New Yorker named Lou, used to say, if the Krauts see your welds, they'll laugh themselves to death before they even shoot. Hal just grinned beneath his mask and kept on welding. The jokes didn't bother him. What did bother him were the occasional cracks in the armor plates others welded too cleanly. Smooth welds sometimes betrayed hidden weaknesses, air pockets, or poor fusion. Hal's ugly seams might have looked crude, but they were solid to the core, thick, uneven ridges that dug deep into the steel, bonding it like bone to muscle. By early 1944, rumors spread through the plant that inspectors were coming. Donnelly grew nervous. He ordered every team to polish, grind, and smooth their welds until the tanks gleamed like mechanical sculptures. We're building the pride of America, he told them. Our craftsmanship must show it. But Hal refused to grind down his welds. He said, you take off that rough, you take off the strength. Donnelly's face turned red. You'll ruin our inspection, he shouted. You're on your last warning, Jensen. Hal shrugged. Do what you gotta do, he said, lighting his torch. Again, the inspectors came and went, noting minor flaws but nothing serious enough to halt production. Donnelly still fumed. He reassigned Hal to night shifts, thinking fewer eyes would see his disgraceful welds. But Hal didn't mind. The quiet of the night suited him. Under the dim hum of hanging lamps, he worked slower, more deliberately, letting the metal tell him when to move. He learned to hear the difference between a weld that would hold and one that wouldn't. It was a sound only experience could recognize, the soft, almost musical hiss when two plates truly fused. In March of 1944, one of Hal's tanks, a Sherman M4A3, rolled off the line and was shipped to England. The serial number was 421,759, but Hal knew it by sight. He had spent extra hours welding its lower hull, layering seams where the armor met near the fuel compartment. Something in him had insisted on reinforcing that section, though no one had ordered it. He'd even left a small mark inside, hidden under the seat of the driver, a tiny HJ, scratched with a nail. It was his way of saying a silent prayer for whoever ended up inside. Months later, that very tank would earn the nickname Faithful. It happened in Normandy, after D-Day. The crew of Faithful was part of the 37th Tank Battalion, tasked with pushing through hedgerows and villages fortified by German anti-tank guns. The enemy's 88mm cannons were infamous, capable of piercing Sherman armor like paper. The tank's commander, Lieutenant Raymond Cooper, was a 26-year-old from Kansas who had already lost 2 tanks in previous engagements. When Faithful arrived, he wasn't expecting much. "They're death traps," he told his gunner. "But we'll ride her till she burns." In late June, during a push through the French village of St. Lo, Cooper's platoon came under heavy fire. German artillery zeroed in on them from a ridge. One shell hit Faithful directly on its right side, near the weld seam of the lower hull, precisely where Hal had reinforced it. The explosion shook the crew, rattled their teeth, but didn't penetrate. Smoke filled the compartment, and the driver yelled that they were still intact. Cooper couldn't believe it. "That should have gone through us," he said. But it hadn't. A second shell hit minutes later, striking the same section. The weld line cracked slightly but held. Cooper ordered the crew to keep moving. They advanced another 100 yards, returning fire, before a third shell slammed into the front lower plate. This time, the impact tore away some armor, but again, the weld seams refused to give. The tank was damaged but not destroyed. Cooper's men called it a miracle. They limped the tank back to the repair depot that night, covered in mud and smoke. At the depot, engineers examined the tank and marveled. 3 direct hits, one said, running his gloved hand along the seams. And the welds held. They called it luck, but Cooper wasn't convinced. He ordered the section cut open to inspect the weld. That's when they found the initials, HJ, hidden under the seat. Cooper kept that piece of metal for the rest of his life. Back in Detroit, Hal never knew. He kept working the night shift, welding tank after tank, unaware that one of his ugly weld lines had saved 5 men in a muddy French village. Donnelly continued to scold him, and Hal continued to ignore him. The war machine didn't pause for sentiment. It demanded output, not stories. But stories have a way of finding their way home. In late 1945, after the war ended, Cooper returned to the States. He visited the Detroit Arsenal as part of a veterans tour organized to thank factory workers. He brought with him the fragment of metal bearing, HJ, and asked if anyone recognized the initials. Donnelly was still there, older, wearier. He said, "HJ. Sounds like one of our welders, Jensen, Harold Jensen." They found Hal working on a civilian tractor chassis, his hands still steady as ever. Cooper approached him, holding the metal. "You weld this?" he asked. Hal wiped the sweat from his brow, looked at it, and nodded. "Looks like one of mine. Ugly, ain't it?" Cooper laughed softly. "Ugly. That weld saved my crew. 3 hits from an 88, and it held. You kept us alive." Hal didn't know what to say. He looked at the jagged piece of steel, now bent and scarred, and thought of all the tanks he'd welded that had gone off to war without faces or names. For the first time, those seams had a story. "Guess ugly's not so bad, then," he said quietly. Word spread through the plant over the following weeks. Workers started saying, "Ugly welds save lives," whenever they talked about strength over looks. Even Donnelly, though he never admitted it aloud, stopped criticizing Hal's methods. After the war, the factory slowed. Many workers left. The urgency that once filled the air was replaced by silence and the slow hum of peace returning. Hal continued welding for a few more years, fixing farm machinery again, patching up tractors for returning veterans who tried to rebuild their old lives. He never sought recognition, never told anyone about the tank called Faithful. But the legend persisted. Some of the men who worked with him would tell newcomers, "You see that old welder? His seams stopped a German shell." Decades later, long after Hal passed away, a group of historians restoring Sherman tanks in a museum found the story buried in archives. Reports of the tank that survived 3 direct hits, the piece of armor with the initials, HJ, and a veteran's note describing a welder from Detroit. They traced it back to Harold Jensen, a man who never received a medal, never appeared in newspapers, but whose hands helped keep others alive. Visitors at the museum now look at that fragment of steel, displayed behind glass, and read the small inscription, from the Sherman tank, faithful, welded by Harold Jensen, Detroit Arsenal, 1944. Survived 3 direct hits. Most just nod and move on, but a few stop longer, staring at the rough, uneven line that still cuts across the metal like a scar. It's not pretty. It's crooked, bulky, jagged, but it's there, defiant and unbroken. If you look closely, you can still see where molten steel once dripped and cooled unevenly, where a welder's steady hand refused to follow the blueprint. Engineers might call it imperfect, but soldiers called it luck. In truth, it was something more. It was the signature of a man who valued strength over show, substance over appearance, and life over aesthetics. The irony, of course, was that the very thing the supervisors mocked became a symbol of endurance. The ugly weld line was later studied by engineers during post-war research. They found that the irregular pattern had actually absorbed and distributed impact energy more effectively than uniform welds. The uneven ridges dissipated shock waves that might otherwise have split the joint clean through. Hal Jensen's instincts, forged through years of practical work and a stubborn belief in listening to the metal, had unknowingly created a stronger bond. Some of the engineers later incorporated this insight into new welding techniques for heavy machinery, and though his name was never mentioned in technical papers, his influence lived on. Somewhere between science and craftsmanship, Harold Jensen's ugly weld became a quiet lesson about the value of imperfection. Hal himself never knew any of that. He retired to a small house near Lake Michigan, where he spent his later years fishing and fixing things for neighbors. Sometimes, when he walked into his shed and saw the old welding torch hanging on the wall, he'd run a finger along its handle and smile faintly. "Guess we did all right," he'd mutter. And perhaps that's the truest kind of legacy, the kind that doesn't need medals or applause, only the knowledge that something you built helped someone survive. The tanks rolled on, the war ended, and the world moved forward. But deep within a museum, beneath layers of time and dust, that one ugly weld line still tells its story in silence. It speaks of heat, of courage, of a welder who believed that perfection was less important than purpose. The welders of that era built the bones of victory, one spark at a time. Most names were forgotten, their labor buried under the weight of history. But somewhere, among the glowing furnaces and echoes of hammers, one man's flawed craftsmanship stood apart, not for its beauty, but for its unbreakable will. So when you stand before that old piece of armor, think not of the smooth seams or polished surfaces that war factories once prized. Think of the jagged line that held when the world tried to break it. Think of Harold Jensen, the welder who taught steel how to survive 3 direct hits, not by being perfect, but by being strong. And remember that sometimes, the ugliest things are the ones that save us.